Mike, as Migration 2013 comes to an end, it's time to kind of look at the behind-the-scenes magic that creates the Redbird scenario, that creates the Redbird visuals, that creates a wholly realistic flight environment on something that at some point either goes on a motion base or sits on your desk. How do you do it?
The first thing to understand about scenarios is they're really nothing new. In Microsoft Flight Simulator 10, missions were part of that package. And Brandon and I both worked at Microsoft for a long time. And the reason missions developed was because we would constantly get questions from users who would get in the Cessna at the end of a runway and ask, what do I do now? So as a result, we developed missions and developed the whole mission system. That all morphed into ESP, which morphed into Prepared by Lockheed Martin. And that's what these sims are using. And that's what this whole scenario system is based on. In scenario-based training, sort of with the FITS approach to things, those can be conceptual scenarios. And you can have scripts that tell an instructor, when a student hits 3,000 feet, pretend to be ATC and tell them to turn left heading 230. All these scenarios do is basically, in code, do that same thing. So there's a trigger, which might be when the airplane hits 3,000 feet, or when it flies through a box, do a certain action. That action might be play a wave file, it might be initiate the movement of an AI aircraft, or something else. So conceptually, it's very simple in terms of those building blocks. And there's some other objects, which are scenery objects and things that can be placed in there. A way to explain it is many, many years ago, I was on a bus with a guy who was a student at MIT studying robotics. And I was very interested in talking to him, tell me about robots and stuff. And all he wanted to talk about was how working with robots makes you understand how amazing humans are, because it's so complicated to make a robot do something that we take for granted. And in the same way, working with these scenarios and creating them is very satisfying, because you're taking something that in aviation is very commonplace and we experience all the time, and figuring out, okay, what of that experience do you want to teach people? And then how do we create the simulated experience so that people can experience exactly that, and all the high points and whatever you want them to experience, without an instructor having to be present. Creating the missions starts with design. I've been working on a lot of that with these scenarios where a request for a scenario will come in, we'll talk to somebody, there'll be a magazine article, let's say something about thunderstorms. We want to create a scenario about diverting around thunderstorms. We have to come up with the logic of that scenario, sort of in the same way that an instructor would if they were creating a scenario-based training scenario to do with students. And then we lay that all out, and then that turns into an audio script, either with a co-pilot or with an instructor on board, or perhaps with air traffic control. And then we hand that over to the developers, and they turn that into the actual scenario using the triggers and actions, which start conceptually, and then they turn into actual code triggers and actions, and there's some tools and things that make that all possible, which Brandon will talk about.
Over the past 2 decades, no resource has compiled as much expert-valued information about the sport plane world than the Sport Plane Resource Guide. Over 1,500 pages, hundreds of aircraft, dozens of how-tos and directories. All this and more will be coming to the sport aviation world soon with the new, all-electronic and updatable Sport Plane Resource Guide for your iPad, iPhone, Kindle, tablet, PC, or other electronic devices. Get your order in now. www.sportplane.com.
Brandon, your compadre here has done a great job of explaining the building blocks here. But you're building whole scenarios, whole missions, things that really matter in the world of flight instruction, because let's face it, nothing's more important than what you put between the ears of a pilot who's just starting to really gel in terms of understanding what this whole thing means.
Yeah, that's right.
So tell me, how do you do it?
Well, it's interesting. Mike talked a little bit about triggers and actions. I like to liken those things to my box of Legos. And those triggers and actions are all different kind of Legos. You can only hook them up certain ways. And I have a limited amount of those things, but the things we can do with them is pretty much infinite. So an example for a good project personally was the Oshkosh EAA Fisk arrival. I know that I can create these experiences for folks. And it's incredibly gratifying for me when someone flies that arrival for the first time in the real world, but has flown it several times in the virtual world and was very comfortable doing it for the first time, which is the opposite of how a pilot might feel if they had not experienced that before.
Outstanding. Show us how you do it.
Sure. So this is the tool we use. All these little nodes are those triggers and actions, those Legos, if you will. It's really kind of a flow chart. When I read a sentence in the NOTAM that says you'll fly over the power plant and either get one runway or the other, you know, I see that as one trigger that branches into two completely different nodes of logic. And so we're kind of looking at a close-up view of how those pieces of logic are hooked together. So if we scroll out of this, we see how complex some of these scenarios get. And so that is all the ATC communicating with the pilot, one for every artificial aircraft that's in the scenario. You know, so in the end, it looks like a bunch of code to us, but somebody that's experiencing it for the first time, they get a virtual Oshkosh arrival that's very accurate to the real world. I think one of the difficult things about an arrival like this is there's so much going on in the radio, and you're not communicating back. So we wanted to have that background chatter, that noise, so that they would really get used to the sense of there's a lot more than just me in this pattern. So this is ATC chatter, what we're looking at here. So in the mission logic, if someone was just flying from one point of ATC contact to the other, the scenario could get very quiet, where in the real world, there are maybe 30 aircraft in this pattern. Well, instead of creating the logic for all 30 of those aircraft, we've created a system that basically just fakes the radio chatter. It's invisible aircraft that aren't really there, and that's what this piece of code does. It just goes through, and when the user is between those two ATC points, it basically plays back a series of radio chatter of what they might be hearing in the real world.
I got to ask you, on a scenario like the Fisk arrival, how much work did that take?
I would say the average scenario for us is about a 3-week development process. We've broken down those mission complexities in levels from 1 to 5, and the Fisk arrival is a 5. When you take a NOTAM and duplicate that or create it in the simulation, you really have to take care to do it right. You know, it's incredibly gratifying when you hear pilots that have flown in and say, wow, you know, that's exactly like it really is, and I felt like I've done it 100 times. It's gratifying, and you know, I think this stuff can really open people's mind to doing things that they may not have otherwise. You know, so it may just be a 20-minute experience on a simulator at an air show, but that may turn a passionate enthusiast into a pilot who is comfortable flying into Oshkosh. They may realize a dream that they didn't think was possible.